Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure on behalf of Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation to welcome you to this event. And that we cooperated with the Singaporean government is not by surprise, because Singapore is one of the major hubs we have here in Asia. It's the hub of 3 of our regional offices in Asia, and showing the importance of this city and this global hub. Well, today it's a topic which really affects both of our countries very much. It strengthens our capacities in many respects, and it's an issue of survival to some extent, for different reasons I would indeed add, because for Singapore as a comparatively small area, it's important to transform the system, and not just mobility but other topics as well, into a more sustainable one. And the option of a smart nation, as you have called this comprehensive plan, is the notion of these efforts. But for Germany as well, indeed, it's a big challenge insofar as digitalization and automotive is at the core, and we have huge comparative advantages. And we have to see indeed what is the cooperation between those countries, where the differences, where the similar challenges. I think this is a vivid topic, and it comprises not just mobility. It goes way beyond. It goes into the urban development. It goes into the issue of transforming the industry. The buzzword of IoT 4.0 is an amazing one in Asia. It's called different, but it's the same purpose. So we have and hope to tackle a topic which is right at the core of our transformation and transformatory policy. Well, if you look into the city of today, and I lived 10 years in Asia, just returning from Hong Kong, I see that mobility, moving people, goods and services is the biggest challenging, and it's not just due to air pollution or congestion, it's the way we organize human living. And Singapore, for example, is a very interesting example how you tried. It's a bit different to what we thought about this topic, but the more interesting it is to compare these different attitudes. The overarching topic of this Asia Pacific Week is indeed innovation, and as I mentioned, digitalization and mobility lay right in the very core. If we talk about future of industry, future of mobility, it's in a nutshell the same. And in this respect, I'm very glad to have you all here. We have experts from Singapore, from Germany. Mr. Oßner, I'm very delighted that representing the German Parliament is here, because I think there's a big debate currently going on. We have not found the solutions. We are struggling with a lot of things, not just in reducing our emissions, which is largely in the traffic and mobility field, but indeed how making more out of this challenge and combining different efforts. But I'm optimistic that we can share experiences, and Ms. Miller, I'm very delighted to have you with us. Ms. Miller will lead through the discussions. Thank you so much for helping us. I would like to conclude with some of the questions which we hopefully will discuss further on here on the panel, as well as with you. It's about how we make more out of this mobility issue if it comes to innovation in a large scale, comprising all the economy. How is this with the comparative advantages? Shall we rather follow the strengths we have in Germany, for example, in the automotive industry, or shall we use the opportunity of disruptive innovation to step ahead and maybe find completely new solutions? This is interesting to look into the different policy strategies, both of Singapore and Germany. And last but not least, it's an issue of how we want to live, how we make most of it. Cities are the future, in particular in Asia. The future is urban, as we always say, and so we have to find solutions in this very compressed living, and Singapore is a perfect example, but I think Germany as well has to deliver and can show the strengths we have. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. I would now like to hand over. There's 2 issues for the household. One is, as it is very tight schedule, you are invited to serve yourself with some beverage and some food even during the event. And the other is, we have a participations list which we would like you to sign. This is, as Mr. Oßner, you know, it's public funding. We have to have the signatures. Please be careful. And if you leave at latest, sign. My assistant will be outside. And there's a lot of publications outside, in particular on developments in Asia, and our latest publication on Singapore as a digital hub is one of the most interesting issues. So, gentlemen, thank you so much again. And now, Mrs. Milner, it's yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Mr. Hefele. Well, I'm Vivika Mittner, and I'm really honored to host this event today. I'm a political editor from Focus Online, and I was really lucky to be in Singapore, I guess it's almost 1 year ago, and I did a research trip over there. So we went there, this was part of a constructive series. We sent 14 reporters to 14 different countries to see what Germany can learn from those countries. So since I was the project manager, I was the one to choose first, and I chose Singapore. So that was really nice. And well, I wrote 5 articles afterwards, and the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation, the members and the office over there helped me a lot. So my articles actually focused on digitalization and how Germany can learn from digitalization in terms of, well, mobility and smart nation, urban, so a lot of different topics, and mobility is probably one of the most interesting ones. So I'm really happy that this is our topic today, and therefore, I think I don't want to digress now, so I would like to introduce to you Mr. Leck. He is the Deputy Group Director of the Land Transport Authority in Singapore, and luckily, his major interest is in autonomous driving, and of course he's an expert in mobility. So I'm really, really happy that he's going to talk about the Singaporean perspective on the future of mobility. So give him a warm welcome, please.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. In the next 20 minutes or so, I'll give you an overview of Singapore's approach to the future of mobility and share with you some of the initiatives that we are in the process of rolling out in Singapore. Thank you. But first, perhaps, let me just get out of your way, actually, so that you can see the slides a little bit better. So perhaps just to give you some statistics to give you an idea of urban mobility in Singapore. So some of you will know that we are a small city state in Southeast Asia. Not very big. I mean, we have just about 720 square kilometers or so, but 5.6 million people on that very densely populated small island. If you look at the number of passenger trips that we have in Singapore every day, it's actually about 10 million passenger trips on a daily basis. So I think it's slightly more than perhaps Berlin or even some of the other cities here in Germany. And of course, in tiny Singapore, we have close to 1 million vehicles. I think on a per capita basis, the number of vehicles we have in Singapore is probably less than in Germany, where I think cars is, well, ownership of cars is perhaps more popular, but I think we have about 1 car for every 10 Singaporeans, but still for us, it's considered quite a high number of vehicles. But these are just some of the urban mobility challenges that we face in Singapore today, and again, this is really to set the backdrop, I suppose, of what I'll touch on a little bit later. So, you know, these are things that I think strike most of us, but in Singapore, because we are small, we're densely populated, a lot of these challenges, I think, hit us quite a bit harder than some other countries. So, of course, like many countries, we are facing increased travel demand as our population and economic activities continue to grow. And as we see that travel demand increase, we're also noticing that change in demand is also a lot more diverse compared to before. Our population is aging, so I think the elderly have different demands from perhaps younger people. But even with the youth of today, you know, they are used to calling for their transport using their smartphones. It's no longer like in the past where you flag down a bus, people want to use a smartphone to call for their vehicles. But, you know, of course, to meet the increase in travel demand, we can't afford to build more roads to cater to that demand. I mean, today in Singapore, about 12% of our land area is already taken up by roads and car parks. And if you compare that to housing, which takes about 14% of our land area, you can see how much road space you know, we are already using. So we can't afford to continue growing our road networks. Together with that, of course, we are facing increasing manpower constraints. It's, I think, something that strikes most countries. You know, it's hard to find drivers, but I think in Singapore especially, it's a tough job. Nobody wants to be a driver. So if you look at, just for example, our public bus industry, half of the drivers we have are actually from overseas. Of the remaining half of the bus drivers we have, the vast majority of them are in their 50s. So in the next generation or two, even the local bus drivers will retire. We can't find younger ones to replace them. So against this backdrop of challenges that we have, this is the vision that we've set up for Singapore. What we want to do is to create this car-light Singapore, where people will choose to walk, cycle, and ride public and shared transport, and where we can do urban mobility, by which I mean the movement of goods as well as people in cities, in the most resource-efficient manner. So we had a land transport master plan that we laid out a couple of years, or 6 years ago. This was the Land Transport 2013, which set a target for 2030 that we wanted to meet. And these are just 3 of the targets that we set out in this Land Transport Master Plan 2013. So first of all, of course, we wanted to increase the number of households that we have living within a 10-minute walk of a train station. And usually in Singapore, when we say train station, it is both the metro as well as suburban rail, but we say rail or trains. We also want at least 85% of public transport journeys of less than 20 kilometers to be completed within 60 minutes. And we want 75% of all journeys in peak hours to be undertaken on public transport. So, this was rolled out back in 2013, and I'm glad to say that I think we are on track to meet these targets by 2030. But this Land Transport Master Plan is something that we do every 5 or 6 years or so. So we have recently begun work on the Land Transport Master Plan for the next bound. This time around, instead of naming it after the year in which we are releasing it, we're naming after the year in which the targets are being set for. So we're calling it the Land Transport Master Plan 2040. And really, I think what we have done is ready to release a set of recommendations by an advisory panel. It's a public-private panel, but the government has accepted the recommendations already. And broadly, this set of recommendations covers these 3 areas. So first of all, I think these are this is what we want to achieve for land transport in 2040 first. We want what we call 20-minute towns and 45-minute city. So if you remember the earlier slide, covering most of our public transport journey within 60 minutes and so on and so forth. What we want to do now is to ensure that journeys, instead of 60 minutes, we want to aim towards achieving them within 45 minutes. Within our towns itself, what we want to do now is to work towards having all journeys completed within 20 minutes. But besides that, we also have this tagline, Transport for All, which means transport being made more inclusive. And finally, of course, we want to work towards what we call healthier lives, safer journey, but I'll give you a bit more details on this in this slide. So, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, for 20-minute towns, what we hope is that all journeys to the nearest neighborhood center is completed in less than 20 minutes. In terms of peak hour journeys, we want 9 in 10 of them to be completed in less than 45 minutes. And of these journeys, public, active, and shared modes of transport should ideally account for 90% of these journeys. Transport for all, one of the things that we kept hearing when we did our public consultations for this Land Transport Master Plan 2040 was, everyone has to play a part in creating this more gracious and caring commuter culture, and something that came out very strongly when we did the public consultations. But of course, I think in terms of being more inclusive as well, I think there was a strong desire for more journeys to be barrier-free, and this is something that we'll work towards. In terms of healthier lives, safer journeys, I think Vision Zero, for instance, is something that Europe is working towards, and it's the same for us as well. But in terms of the environment as well, we also want cleaner energy vehicles, as well as vehicles that make less noise pollution. I have some examples of the strategies that we will undertake to achieve the objectives I just laid out. But I think in the interest of time, I won't go through all of them. If you actually just Google LTMP 2040, you'll find everything here actually covered. It's quite easy to find online. But essentially for most of these, a lot of these strategies are not new strategies. It's something that we've been working towards for the last many years actually. So things like prioritizing public, active, and shared modes of transport, trying to facilitate more seamless multimodal travel, including using technology, doing what we call polycentric development, where we are hoping to develop more regional centers, and so that we can then bring jobs and amenities closer to where people live. Nurturing a gracious, caring commuter culture I mentioned earlier. Vision Zero, working towards that. So I won't cover, I think, the details of this. Please do Google and find it online if you're interested. But I think the idea is, as I've said, LTMP really builds on existing policies and strategies. And some of these, I think, may be familiar to some of you. So, of course, in Singapore, we have been actually very highly rated for a very affordable public transit system. And that's something that I think we hope to keep, of course, because we do want to encourage Singaporeans to take public transport as much as possible. We have also been working, I think, to enhance the commuting experience, whether you're talking about building more sheltered walkways, because in Singapore it rains a lot. So if you don't have sheltered walkways, people are not going to walk everywhere, including to the rail stations. Right? We're also trying to ensure that service standards are met so that, again, people will take to public transport. And of course, we are working towards building a more robust land transport ecosystem in terms of trying to really transform the workforce that we have to prepare them for the future. And finally, this is something that has, I think, often made the news about Singapore, but we have a very aggressive car ownership management policy in Singapore. So I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but as of last year, we have capped the number of vehicles in Singapore. And the vehicle population in Singapore will no longer increase. So even as our population increases, the number of vehicles in Singapore will stay constant. So that was a policy that we had undertaken last year, but we had already been preparing for it over the last several years by slowly decreasing the rate of increase year by year by year. So I think we started maybe by limiting growth to 3% to 1.5%, and then as of last year, we're capping it at 0% growth. Of course, together with vehicle ownership, we also have a very, again, I suppose, aggressive congestion management policy. We have something called electronic road pricing in Singapore, but it's not something new. I mean, we have been doing congestion charging in Singapore since 1975, actually. So I think we're probably the first country in the world to actually practice congestion charging. And in the late 1990s, we moved from, I suppose, a more manual way of doing congestion charging to what we have electronic road pricing, where vehicles passing through these gantries as they go into certain geofence zones will have to pay a certain charge. But I think besides policies and strategies, I think we're also working towards leveraging technology to help us achieve some of the goals that I've just laid out. So 3 areas that I think we are really trying to tap on: big data, the Internet of Things, automation. But of course, undergirding all of this is also AI, or artificial intelligence, which is common across all 3. And so actually for the second half of my presentation, what I'm going to do is to focus on specific initiatives that will give you an idea of how we are tapping on these 3 technologies to help us achieve our aims. So first of all, how do we tap on technologies to enhance our public transport operations and planning? I mentioned earlier about rail and how it's an important part of our daily commute. We are actively expanding our rail network so that by 2030, we'll have about 360 kilometers of rail lines. If you consider the Land Transport Master Plan 2013, when we first put out this vision, we had about 178 kilometers of rail lines back then. So we're going to double the number of the length of our rail lines, rather, over the next 12 or so years now. And I think we're building almost at the rate of a kilometer a month. And in Singapore, a lot of this is underground, so it's kind of challenging actually to tunnel through a very hard granite rock. But I think this shows you how seriously we take rail, and with that, the move really to encourage people to take to rail more, to take to public transport more. But of course, I think what's important to us is even as we build more rail lines, we want to make sure that reliability is enhanced. So we're doing a couple of things to try and do that. One is really through the installation of more IoT sensors, but also together with that, using the data from those sensors and using data analytics to help us do better condition monitoring and better predictive maintenance. So what we've done, for instance, is to install sensors such as heat sensors, vibration sensors on our trains, so that these are indicators of when things might break or things might go wrong. And once you get warnings, we are then better able to do predictive maintenance. We have also, for some of our trains, installed laser and vision camera sensors under the train, so that as they pass the tracks, they can scan the tracks, and we are then again alerted if there are any anomalies. But beyond that, of course, we're trying to put in place a smart asset management system where you aggregate all the data that you collect. And again, you can then, with all the data that you have, better do trend predictions, better do predictive maintenance. Another initiative that we have is through the introduction of on-demand, dynamically routed public bus services. So in a sense, this is kind of like your Uber. I don't know whether Uber is a dirty word in Germany, but it's kind of like your Uber, or in Singapore, it's the Grab equivalent, where you can call for a public bus on your smartphone. The difference is that this bus, at least the way we're running the trials now in Singapore in 3 areas, is that the bus will only pick you up from your bus stop. But I think what's different from the traditional bus routes where, the bus runs a fixed route, with this on-demand dynamically routed bus service, if there are no passengers here, for instance, the bus can then just go to where there are passengers instead, and that makes for a more efficient journey overall for the commuters. And this is another example from about, I think, 5 years ago now. We have installed IoT sensors in all of our public buses, and what these sensors do is that they give us an idea of where they are at any point in time. So this allows us a number of things. One is for the general public, they now have a better idea of when the buses are coming, right? But they also have an idea of the loading, because what we can then do is to pump out data regarding how many passengers there are on board the buses, and then the commuters can then know how heavily loaded the buses are. For the public transport operators, of course, this whole system allows them to better manage their fleets. So we want to make sure that the buses are on time, that they run on scheduled regular headways, so the operators can also manage the bus fleets by telling them to speed up or slow down so that they get to the bus stops on time. But of course for LTA, which is the regulator, this also gives us a real-time, performance monitoring tool, because we do regulate the industry and ensure that they meet certain service levels, as I mentioned earlier. So this gives us a tool to monitor their performance as well. So we get about 80 million data points per day from this system that we have, and it gives us a bus arrival time accuracy of about 95%. But beyond this is another example of how we are, I think, trying to tap on data analytics as well as IoT really, to help us better manage public transport operations as well as to better do planning. So what we do is that we take data from, I think, various sources. From the fare card data, the cards that people use to tap in and tap out of our rail or buses, together with Wi-Fi, cellular data, other data like video data from CCTV. We fuse all of this data to give us an idea, for instance, of things like how crowded our rail stations are. Because I think as crowds build up, that is already a red flag for us in terms of whether there are any potential issues that we need to watch out for. So with this data and this analysis capability, we're better able to do things like, having earlier incident notifications, and that allows us to better do contingency planning. So if we think that there might be potential challenges in terms of a train breaking down or trains running more slowly, we can then, dispatch more customer service people to the rail platforms to manage the crowds. We're better able to then, alert our bus operators to provide bus bridging services to cater for commuters that may then have to move from the rail network to taking buses instead to complete their journeys. But of course, with all the data that you have, you're also better to able to do trend analysis to, look at what are the changing commuter demands, and that allows us to also do forward planning as well. The next area that we're using technology to help us with is really smarter traffic management. So I mentioned earlier that we have an electronic road pricing system. We are working towards rolling out the next generation electronic road pricing system by the early 2020s or so. In fact, we should roll it out from about next year onwards. And what this does is that we will install in every single vehicle in Singapore an onboard unit that will actually give us a real-time location of every single vehicle in Singapore. So imagine with all the data that we get, how we can then optimize traffic flows and manage traffic in Singapore at least. I suspect in other countries where there are concerns about privacy and so on, it's something that may not be so easily achieved. In Singapore, I think our public is a bit more understanding, but even then, I think we want to assure people that it's the data that we get is always anonymized and aggregated. In fact, we keep them on separate systems so that we make sure that there's also data privacy is looked after. But essentially, with this data that we have, we are able to do a lot of things, and one of them really is that we can also pump data down to the individual vehicle to nudge the drivers to do certain things. So for instance, I can send a message to the cars traveling along a particular road to say that 5 or 10 kilometers ahead of you, there's a traffic jam, so can you please divert? And we can even send different messages to the same, to different vehicles on that same road to say, some of you divert to this road to the left, others divert to this road on the right, so that we even out the traffic and not cause more congestion as well. So there are a lot of possibilities with this. But beyond that, I think we're trying to put in place this, it's a very long acronym, but I'll just call it CRUISE. What we're trying to do is to develop this next generation traffic light management system that can take in data from all of this, all of the data that we get from ERP2, from all the vehicles that we have, and then that better allows us to optimize traffic flows using intelligent algorithms as well. But beyond that, you can do other things, like giving priority to emergency vehicles, giving public buses priority, so on and so forth. So with data, IoT, and intelligent algorithms, there's really a lot of things that we can do to better manage traffic. And finally, I think this is another area that we're working very hard towards, is enhancing public transport autonomous vehicles, and it's something, of course, very close to my heart since it's an area that I'm working on personally. For us, I think autonomous driving is a key focus, and we are talking about how we want to use the technology to transform public and shared transport. So several reasons. I mean, we want to use AVs to help us improve first, last mile connectivity through a variety of means. I mean, first is, of course, to help us improve regularity of bus services. Again, with machines, I think it's easier to manage regularity and reliability. But secondly, through the use of on-demand technologies, we also want to improve the quality of service and accessibility for commuters. So imagine if you're someone with a disability, or if you're elderly, you can call for an on-demand shuttle that can come pick you up closer to your homes and drop you off closer to where you want to go. So it increases accessibility for vulnerable commuters. But I think beyond that, what we hope is that through really increasing the reliability, accessibility, and convenience of public transport, we want to move people away from private ownership of vehicles, the Car Light Singapore that I mentioned earlier. But secondly, also by really with AVs, I think you may know that because the vehicles are talking to one another, to infrastructure, they're able to travel far more closely to each other, and therefore you can also optimize road space. But with that, what we then hope is that we can then reduce the reliance on private cars, and also achieve, I suppose, take away even roads and repurpose roads for other users as well. And this is really what in the second point here about resource optimization. So first, of course, you can use AVs to help with manpower. We can achieve manpower savings from the deployment of AVs. We can also achieve more optimal allocation of resources through on-demand services. The land savings I mentioned, less roads, less car park needed. But even in the very near term, we can also achieve reductions in things like bus depot sizes. Finally, of course, I think we hope that Singapore can be an AV hub to develop some of these technologies. But broadly, this is the roadmap that we have for the deployment of AVs. Our focus is really on these 4 tracks here. The first 2 tracks are more to do with public and shared transport, your traditional fixed route scheduled service buses. The second track is to do more with on-demand point-to-point mobility services. The third and fourth tracks are more to do with freight and logistic operations, and finally the fourth track is on utility operations, things like street cleaning, rubbish collection, and so on. So if you notice already, our focus is not on using AVs for privately owned vehicles. Again, I keep going back to this Car Light Singapore, where we want to encourage people to move away from private car ownership to the use of public and shared transport. Right. And today we are in phase 1 of this roadmap, where we're really talking about test bidding the technologies in various parts of Singapore. We hope to soon move to phase 2, where we are hoping to pilot the deployment of AVs as public and shared transport in 3 of our towns by the early 2020s. So that's already something that we're working on, including with companies in Germany as well. And then finally, phase 3 is, of course, when we're talking about full operation deployment of AVs across all of Singapore. But together with that, we also recognize that to enable deployment, we need to put in place many enablers, and I'll touch on a little bit about that later. And this is just to give you an idea of how we visualize future town centers with AVs. In the future, we still see our train network as the backbone of our public transport network. It'll still be the most efficient way of transporting people. It's 1,600 people per train coming every 2 to 3 minutes. Nothing can beat that. But if you're talking about, there's still scope for buses to run your fixed route scheduled services, on-demand shuttles. But this is where I mentioned earlier that we're hoping that with the introduction of AVs, we can potentially remove or repurpose some of the road space, car park space that we have, and use them for recreational communal spaces, such that we increase the quality of life for Singaporeans. You may notice some drones in the air. If we have time, I can talk more about it maybe during Q&A. But we have a night view to accompany the day view as well in terms of our vision. But this is where I think we're talking about during off-peak hours, autonomous trucks, autonomous utility vehicles coming out to do what they need to do. Because again, today I think to get drivers to drive at night, for companies it's additional costs. But with autonomous technology, you don't need to worry about paying drivers overtime, right? And the idea is really to even out traffic flows across all times of the day, because today I think for all of us, we build our road infrastructure to cater to peak demand, which is ridiculous because during off-peak hours, the road infrastructure is underutilized. But imagine, with autonomous technology, you can equalize traffic flows across all times of the day, and therefore you make far better use of the infrastructure that you have. So these are just some of the initiatives that we have to facilitate AV deployment. There are, I think, as I mentioned already, numerous ongoing AV trials in Singapore, with several test beds actually. The largest test bed that we have allows for trials on public roads in about 70 kilometers of roads. 70 or 140, depending on how you count it. We're also working towards, we have also developed a testing regime and AV standards to facilitate deployment. We're probably one of the few countries today to have a testing regime in place before we allow AVs to fly on public roads. And maybe during Q&A I can touch on a little bit more about that. We have also released a set of AV standards back in January, again to provide guidelines for AV developers who are thinking about deploying in Singapore. And of course we have also reviewed and revised our regulatory regime to facilitate deployment as well. So with that, I'll stop here, and I thank you very much for your attention. Perhaps just to do a bit of a shameless plug for Singapore, we are hosting the ITS World Congress in October this year, October 21st to 25th. So if there's interest, we do welcome you to join us in Singapore for the ITS World Congress. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your input. I now want to talk about the German perspective on the future of mobility, because we already hit the Singaporean, but there's also a really interesting German perspective, and therefore I would like to ask Mr. Oßner and Mr. Siebert, who is here for Mr. Nurudi, who is on your program, so don't worry, he's also from Door to Door. So Mr. Oßner is a member of the Committee on Transport and Digital Infrastructure of the German Parliament. And Mr. Siebert is from the on-demand mobility platform Door to Door, and he's the lead policy and regulatory affairs. So please come on stage and we will talk over here.
Einen Stuhl.
I would like to invite all of you to ask questions during the discussion, so don't be shy, just speak really loud because we don't have Wi-Fi microphones, but feel free to ask questions during the discussion, and please also feel welcome to talk to each other during the discussion, so you don't need to wait for me. Okay. So, Mr. Oßner, when you hear about the ideas Mr. Leck presented, what do you think? Are these ideas new to you?
I think I have to congratulate the Singapores. That's really, really interesting and a great future view what you have given us. And I think it's, especially in the urban area, it's very similar. But I think the big difference between Singapore and Germany is that we have a lot of rural areas, and the transition of the mobility, I think it's will be great harder to transit it than it's in the area of the urban areas or in the cities, and that's why I think we had in 2016 we had a decision to invest about 260 billion euros till 2030, and especially the rural areas are now pointed on it that they get not less money than the urban areas get, and that's why we have to take all these interests into account. And that's why it's great harder, but really congratulations to this future targets you get, and I hope you will reach all these targets.
Is Germany as innovative as Singapore?
I'm surprised about the data privacy and the data security. You know, in Germany we had a lot of discussions about it, especially in the area of big data, etc. And I'm the more liberal one who will fight for it, that we can take these data, which we can achieve today, we can get it into account and to organize all the transportation in our country, but the more left-winged parties have great problems to discuss about this, and especially in this case it's quite hard to get it so liberal that you presented it to us. That's why the question how is more innovative, I think in this case it's 1-0 for Singapore.
Okay, probably data is something really important for you as well. Could you tell a little bit what you're doing?
Of course. So we're a tech company based in Berlin, 7 years old, and it all started with two of our founders stranded together at an airport when nothing else was possible to move. So it was a time when this volcano from Iceland spilled a smoke cloud all over Europe, and they were stranded and there was no way back, and they were thinking about how can we connect the different modes of mobility to get back home? Why isn't there an app? Why isn't there a platform we can use to figure our way back home? And that's how it all started. And now we have 3 pillars in our business model that we do. First of all, I'd like to point out that we are, as a tech company, we are always in a partnership with cities and public transport operators. We are not like Uber or others who want to offer a fleet by themselves and take over the customers from the PTOs. Our idea is to make public transport more efficient, to make it more comfortable for the customer, for the user. So people would be driven out of their cars into public transport, and so we reduce private car use in cities, and we can reduce congestion, pollution, and on the other hand, make more space for people, so space for people, not cars, like for recreational areas that you pointed out. So the first thing that we do is big data analysis of the mobility situation in cities and regions. So where do people live, where do they want to go, and what is already there? What is the supply of mobility in my city? What is public transport? What other modes are there? Then we look at the white spots on the map. So why isn't there any service where people want to go? And we analyze the demand of the people. Why do they want to go this way, and why do they use private cars? We use demand data like private car data. I think it's fantastic that you have so many data sources in Singapore that we could use for big data. In Germany, it is way harder to find data sources to analyze the mobility situation properly. So we have mobile phone data we can use, cell movie, which is not very granular, so it's kind of rough data. We have GPS data from private cars, but this is also only in the beginning in Germany. We have other like census data, and last census is about 10 years old. So you see the difficulties that we have, but if we use other data spots we get on the market, we have a good overview of what's going on in cities. Second thing is what we do is on-demand services, on-demand ride pooling, but those are operated by local players, by PT, and if they don't want to buy an own fleet of cars and vehicles, integrated taxis, smaller private bus companies use the resources that are already at hand in the cities and make them more useful by pooling passengers on the first place, and second, make the routes in real time as efficient as possible. Third thing that we do is the passenger app for this ride pooling service is intermodal. Now it's multimodal, but will be intermodal soon. We combine and integrate every other service that is out there. Bike sharing, ride sharing, scooter sharing, so that for the passenger, you have a one-stop shop. You have one app, you can plan, you can book, you can pay, and you don't have to switch between apps, and make it as easy as possible to move around the city.
Well, you talked about the rural landscape, and you also did that we have some problems over there. So what kind of challenges do we face there?
I think when you concern it or compare it with the 5 key trends for the future mobility, the connected cars, the autonomous cars, the shared values or the shared car use, the electrified and the regulated part, then you can say that especially the connected and autonomous car area, it's quite hard to organize it in the rural area, especially in the same way than you can do it in the urban areas. Especially the connected way, we had a lot to do with our mobile digitalization in our country. That's why we have to build up a lot of sending units to get it, and especially in the rural area, we have to invest a lot of money in this case. With the autonomous one, I think it's in my view, I think it could be a big chance for the rural area, especially for the older getting population, that you are mobile when you're older. And that's why I think we have to organize it like in a way that especially the 16 countries or the 16 Länder in Germany get really autark decisioning to organize it in their rural, in this rural area. And the shared one, I think it will be the most difficult one, since you have not so many people who are able to share. And that's why I think we have to organize it in a way that, especially Mr. Seibert told us before, that you can get it in a way that, especially the lot of privately owned cars, which we have, are able to are connected with good software to these ones which do not have any owned car. And I think it's possible, especially with the first point, the connected one, and the mobility, especially with the mobile connection, that when we will get the first step, then you can organize the shared development in a better way. And that's why I think it's more to invest, but I think in the same way to organize, but it will take a lot of strengthening and a lot of money. And that's why we have to put in here a big pressure on it.
I think you already tested some shared mobility projects in Bavaria.
Yeah, so at the moment we have 5 customers in rural areas in Germany. One is operational already, which is a small region of Freyung, which is only 7,000 inhabitants. So you can see a car-sharing fleet wouldn't make sense in such a region, especially not a free-floating one, because nobody would take the cars back to where you need them. So when we started there, they had 1 bus line, and the bus was traveling through 3 bus stops, and the frequency was every 2 hours. And that is not my understanding of mobility, especially not for older people who don't have a car anymore, who don't have the capacity to drive anymore. So we came up with a solution to have 2 minibuses in a small area that are on a mobility platform that can be booked by app, that can be also booked by phone, because older people often have problems with using newer technologies like apps and smartphones. And we had also a booking algorithm possible through a web browser, so like a doctor's office, a shop, a hairdresser salon, whatever you want, whatever you need, can book for their customers so that they would have that minibus service, and that the routing is in real time, so you can pool as many people as possible. And the people, especially the local politicians, they really push the project, and they have like certain, like when there is the weekly market, everybody comes together at the market once a week. They offer the rides, the bus rides to the market and back for free, so nobody is using the car anymore because they don't have the space in the small inner city for people traveling by car. And we're talking about a region where every household owns about 3 cars because there is no other mode of transportation. So we have a young family, the mom, the dad both need a car to go to work or drive the kids to school. And if you get adult children, you have 3 cars in the family, and that is something we want to avoid. We know in the rural it's different types of rural areas, but compared by density degree in the area. But we don't want people to rely on 3 cars anymore. We think if you need 1 car, it's okay. If you need 2, maybe you don't, and 3 is a no-go in our perspective. So reduce car numbers and offer a new mobility service for people there in the rural area, and connect them and make it possible for everyone to use it, especially for elder people. So accessibility, to make it wheelchair accessible and stuff like that, is really something that we've been working on for a long time, and integrated also accessible features in our app, so everybody who has a special need can articulate that during the booking process and get the right vehicle and the right assistance.
You also work with, for the national platform Future of Mobility. Is that something which is part of the platform, or could be part?
Yes, for sure. I think it's nearly the same target what we have with the national platform of future mobility. We have 6 working groups for it, and in this 6 working groups, especially these things Mr. Siebert explained us, are a big part of it, I think, especially the climate protection you told us before. It's in the first group, and it's one of our biggest point. Then we want to reduce over 40% the greenhouse pollution, and that's why, as for us, exactly the most important part to get more attractiveness in this mobility transition. The second one, the sustainable mobility, especially with the alternative drives and fuels, is near to that, to the first one, and the national platform have, I think, in my view, a lot of to do, especially what's the alternative fuels. In my view, it's a lot to do in this case, especially all the debate in our country about the diesel and the petrol and the stuff which we can go over to the electricity and to the e-mobility. I'm sorry, and that's why I think this transition you have a lot of possibilities to organize it, especially perhaps with gas. In this part of transition, you can organize it perhaps a little bit with green produced gas. You can perhaps organize it, especially with hydrogen, especially with the cells, with the H cells. That's why I think you have a lot of possibilities to organize it. And the third group, it's concentrated on the digitalization of the mobility sector. It's exactly which door-to-door focused on. The fourth group is to secure the mobility and the production side, especially the value chain. It's completely changing. For us, I'm coming from an area which is very intensive in the car production, and especially the normal engine. It will not have any use in this way in the future, and it's not a diesel or a petrol engine. It's an electricity engine, and that's why we have a lot of changing, especially in the social case and especially in the value chain. We will build up a battery cell production in Germany, especially our car producer very focused on that. And the raw materials, especially the recycling of the batteries, etc. That's more the group 4, which is concentrated on that. The group 5 focused on the interconnection and the transport and energy networks and the sector coupling. Before we heard from you that you are very focused on the train transportation, especially in this case. For us, it's a really decisioning point how we can connect the street with the trains and for sure with the water transport. That's why I think we have here a lot of possibilities to get a little bit more efficient and to take this into account, that we can get a little bit better in that. And the sixth group, the last one, it goes about the standardization and the certification, and especially this will be perhaps the hardest one. my wish would be then we could be a little bit like Singapore, that we can perhaps to get the answers for these questions a little bit easier than we have it in Germany. And I think this is a big part which we have to solve, and that's why it's very interesting what you said before.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think what is very important is that all those different topics in the different working groups are totally interconnected, so it's hard to make a barrier, a cut between the different groups. So of course sharing and digitization is one key factor. On the other hand, if you use cars with autonomous cars and cars with an alternative engine and bundle those two components with the shared mobility, you solve so many more problems if you think outside the box and bring all those components together. And also, we Germans, we tend to think in boxes. That is our silos that we have. There is energy, there is water, there is traffic. So I think that we can learn a lot from Singapore here, because last time I was in Singapore, I saw how mobility and urban planning, how well it is interconnected, and how well, when I come out of an MRT station, I have my shops, and there is a hotel, there's a living area, so there's everything connected, so I don't need a car. If I step out of the train, I have my shopping I can do and I can go home. I have my leisure activities. It is all well planned, so we don't have those extra ways I have to go. Like in Germany, you have to go this way and that way to get all your different things done. And in Singapore, somebody thought ahead before they built a train line and before they built a new quarter in the city. It's better connected. I think something we can learn here in Germany is to think outside our silos and put the things together and work together on that.
Well, just one more question, and then we continue with the panel discussion. Well, to come back to Chris Leck's favorite topic, to the autonomous driving, do I get to work by autonomous vehicles in 5, 10, or 20 years? So what do you think?
So we are already in cooperation with different companies that are developing autonomous vehicles. So our platform at the moment is already built to work with autonomous vehicles as well, because we think the highest cost factor and the biggest problem is drivers in our day, and you already pointed that out. So we are already working with ZF, Ego, and others to figure out how to make it work. And at the CES in Las Vegas, we already showcased that on-demand pooling for goods and for people is both possible in autonomous vehicles. And we think first it will be in rural areas to start, because a mixed traffic between autonomous and not autonomous vehicles will be a huge challenge. So I think in rural areas where there's less traffic, it is easier to implement autonomous driving. But from what I know, and I've been talking to lots of car manufacturers as well, I think in 5 to 10 years we'll be ready to have autonomous vehicles on the street. I think in 5 or 6 for rural areas, and in 7 to 10 we might be able to have a fully integrated system of AV vehicles in urban areas as well.
Is that something you can relate to?
I can underline it for sure. We have a test bed for the autonomous vehicles on the Highway 9, on the A9 in Bavaria. And that's why I think we are on a good move on it, that we can test it in real life. But for sure, the car producers are promised us to produce it in 2025 in a series. That's why I think it's just 6 years we have for it, that we get the frame for the autonomous mobility. And that's why it's quite hard. I have to come back to my first, I think one of my first points I said in this panel, that we have to get the frame, especially in the mobile connection. And especially in the rural area, it's get a little bit harder to get it just in time, especially with the 5th generation of the mobile data transferring. And that's why I think this is perhaps the trigger at the end for the autonomous driving. But when we get this, and we do all for it and invest a lot, that we get it really in all over the area and all over the rural area. And when we have it, then I think it's the best step, and it's the start for the autonomous driving.
Sounds good. So thank you. I would now like to Like, I'm really honored to introduce to you His Excellency, the Ambassador of Singapore, Mr. Lawrence Bay. So it's probably going to be a bit cozy for us. Well. Well, we heard a lot about the Singaporean and the German perspective on future mobility. Where do you see commonalities between the two countries?
Well, first, I think having heard everyone paint a very nice picture, I think it's also important for us to firstly remember that it's not going to be that simple. A lot of what you have heard, I think some of it is a bit of a wish list. Some are still a work in progress. I think whether it's Germany or Singapore, we are still experimenting with technology, even with regulatory frameworks. You know, no one quite knows what eventually it will look like in 2020, 2030 or 2040. But I think, having said all that, we all have a Germans and Singaporeans. I think we all share the view that something's got to change. The way we move has to change because it is not going to be what it is like. In a city like Berlin or even in Munich, you know, say in the 19th century or, you know, even after World War II, at that time when people move around, you know, mostly it's about trams. I don't think many people cycle. Most people walk, maybe by horse or something like that. But in 10, 20 years, we saw a whole transformation of how people move around. And I think that same transformation is going to happen. Part of it is because we have to respond to certain challenges. In the case of Singapore, as Chris said, you know, population is, you know, not very big to begin with, and, you know, for some reasons, people don't really want to work as drivers. So you have to respond to a challenge. But I think the other aspect of it is also very true. If you don't start responding, you are going to lose business. You're not going to be able to do a lot of the things. Say, for example, you are in a digital industry and you have a great idea, and you want to produce this good. Who's going to deliver it for you? How are you going to get your supplies? These are fundamental questions of mobility that have to be resolved. If they are not addressed, we're going to have a big challenge. So I think in that respect, both Germany and Singapore all have to put our minds together and deal with these issues.
Okay, so where do you see opportunities for cooperation between Singapore and Germany?
I think there are many opportunities for us to cooperate. So it's all down to details. I think just sitting there and listening to all the speakers that have spoken so far, I myself feel very excited about what the future is going to look like. And already, I think it all depends on what business you're in. I sat next to a lady who said she was from public relations, I think. You know, and then I was like thinking to myself, what is a lady from a public relations firm doing in a mobility forum, right? And then suddenly it occurred to me when I listened to all the presentations, I listened to what Door to Door is doing, someone's got to present the information in a user-friendly way. So you may not be directly involved in traditional mobility kind of business, but I think if you think hard enough and you see where the commercial opportunities are, I'm pretty sure very quickly you will be able to say that my company needs to invest some money or some resources in doing this and this, because mobility is a growth industry. It is a growth industry. Something's going to change. We know it's going to change in a massive way, not just here in Germany or Singapore. It's going to change internationally. A lot of what we've heard so far this afternoon focuses a lot on land transport. Right? We talk about trains, we talk about cars, autonomous vehicles, self-drive vehicles. That's just the land aspect. We haven't talked about maritime. We haven't spoken about aviation. In Singapore, in the second half of this year, we're going to launch the pilot trial of air taxis. And it's run by a German company, Volocopter, which incidentally I'm going to visit next week. I hope they will give me a chance to test on their Volocopter. You know, then I can say I'll be the first to test on that. But anyway, they're going to test. You know, and I was very fascinated that where I was thinking to myself, where in Singapore would they use to test? And they've decided to test this air taxi service between islands of Singapore, offshore islands. And I think it makes a lot of sense, because if I'm a tourist or I'm someone from Germany and I'm looking to have a good suntan, I'm going to take an air taxi to go from one island to another island to suntan. So there you have it. You're going to an example of how a German company and Singapore are collaborating, not just in the technology sphere, but also in terms of regulation, in terms of safety. I think all these, there are many, many areas that we can work together.
So how do you see the future of mobility for both Singapore and Germany? Is that air taxi?
As things stand, there's already a lot of collaboration on the R&D side. I see growing cooperation on the commercial field. I think what Florian was alluding to is a very important point in the sphere of standards and regulatory framework, because that is the part that governments, whether in municipal governments, in rural regions, or in urban cities like Berlin or Munich, we are all grappling with it. What sort of rules, guidelines make sense? Because all our cities look very different. What is applicable for a city like München, cannot be applied to a city in Singapore. In München, no buildings are allowed to be built higher than the Frauenkirche, within a 30-kilometer radius, which means actually if the Bavarian government was quite brave, they can fly drones and air taxis very easily. But in Singapore, every building is like a few hundred meters high. I mean, you've got to really think about what sort of rules really make sense. So I think, notwithstanding the different contexts that we are in, there's actually a lot that we can talk about in terms of regulations and how we can draw up regulations that make sense. And in that regard, actually Singapore has already launched, recently we launched Technical Reference 68. It sounds very technical and all these numbers, and nowadays we have Master Plan 2040, 2030. For it to sound convincing, you have to have some alphabets and some numbers. So we have this TR68, which actually lays out what are the technical requirements for self-drive vehicles. And it is arguably probably the first in the world. And I think this is something we want to work with our German partners to help us to refine this framework, so that then corporations and startups, companies, they all can work together. If you are a startup, I just want to say that, or a small company in the mobility sector, I think don't run away the impression that all these kind of projects can only be done by the BMWs and the Daimlers or the Siemens. I think door-to-door is a very good example of how a startup can also participate. If you've got a good idea, find a place to let your idea be known. In Singapore, later this year in November, we are going to have an event called Slingshot 2019. It is a global pitching competition. It is open to startups from all over the world in many different sectors. I think this will be a good opportunity for, if you're an aspiring company to participate. Just before I came here, I did a quick internet search. If you look at the top 8 startups who are candidates of unicorn status meaning you are able to raise a capital of at least 1 billion. Out of 8 German startups in that category or in that segment, at least 6 are in the transportation sector. So, yes, maybe we are 1-0 in some ways, but if I look at other areas, I think Germany could well be 1-0, because in the startup sphere, I look at the top startup companies in Singapore, maybe 1 or 2, and Grab quickly comes to mind. But that's all that I have in my mind, Grab. I cannot think of other companies. In Germany, you have Volocopter, you have Lilium, you have a lot of other very exciting startups. So if you are a company looking to grow, looking for external markets, think of Slingshot 2019.
Mr. Leck, would you please join us on stage? Just one more time, if you have any questions, just feel free, give me a hand sign, and I will, you can just ask your questions. So feel free, don't be shy, and just, yeah. So, Mr. Oßner, I think that in Munich we were actually talking about parking spots for air taxis. I think like last summer it was, and now if I hear that, it's not that, like for me it was not realistic. I was like, okay, air taxis in Munich?
I think, yeah, For sure, the first time you hear air taxis, oh my God, what's that? And is it really necessary? And goes it really into the future? But on the other side, I think, especially in the urban areas, which you have a lot of time on the street, what you lose every day when you go to work or something else. That's why I think it's, on my view, it's a really interesting idea, and we presented it in Ingolstadt. It's near to Munich, but it's in Bavaria, the new air taxis. And I think everyone who saw it live was really excited about it. And that's why I think we have to give it a chance, but it's one step of a lot of steps what we have to do. And especially, like the ambassador said, in a very perfect in a really very perfect view, we are definitely in common that we have to change our mobility for the future, and that's why we had to do a lot of small steps or big steps to go into to come further on. And the one part are the air taxis, the other parts, especially what are in the format of these ones who really want to come from A to B, it will be the autonomous driving. The other one will be, I think, especially what you can do with trains. We did not talk about it or not more about it, or not much about it, but I think it's a really big step for us to get a really good train network from one city to another city, but we invest a lot in it, and that's why I think in combination of all these mobility points we get that for the people it's more attractive, it's faster, it's more efficient, perhaps it could be a little bit more cheaper than it's today from come to A to B. It's especially when you compare it with the train prices for us. A lot of people are a little bit angry about it, and it's these prices are too high, and that's why in combination of all that I think we can get to a society which accepted the new forms of mobility, and especially when it's in before you're a little bit afraid of it, but new things, especially for Germans, which are famous, that the famous child, I think, is the car. And when you lose your car, it's quite hard for everyone, for us. But I think we have to change a little bit in mind that the future will take perhaps a little bit different picture.
There's one question in the audience.
First one is to Mr. Oßner. We heard from Singapore that you think about abandoning cars in the future to make space. Germany is a really strong automotive country. So do you, in your work, see a tension, or do you come across a reluctant behavior by the automotive companies in this transformation towards a better public transport system? Is there, can you say, are they opponents? Is there a struggle going on? Then I would be interested in your experience more in depth with implementing these innovative traffic systems. What are the most common challenges that you face when you go to a little community or a town? And in the end, of course, Mr. Leck, we would like to know about the drones.
Could you please repeat the question? Because I'm not sure if you hear the questions in the back of the room. Just repeat it before you answer. That would be.
I think when I understood it really correctly, I think it's what are the parts our car industry makes it to move a little bit or to go a little bit forward in connecting or to organize mobility of the future. I say it in my own words. And yeah, we have here a big transformation time. since all the car producers are a little bit afraid of this changing, which they are now affronted, and that's why the most of them are take into account that they have to offer car sharing projects. The second point, I think it's very, on my view, very important that they see it as, I think, one of perhaps the most important part, that they get into the e-mobility. They invest a lot now, especially with the battery concerned e-mobility, but a part of it on the H2 mobility. We have our own foundry from the government to enforce these technology, and I think I'm really, I think it's a really exciting technology which we should take into account, and especially China, I think, is very interested in this technology, and I heard, I think it's about 2 weeks ago, that they want to enforce the H2 mobility more than the normal battery based e-mobility. And perhaps the third point, for the car industry in our country, and even every fifth employer is connected with the car industry, and it's really great in which transition time we are in it, and that's why I think it's the most important thing that the car industry will search for new employment areas, not just the engine production, a little bit said it before, then especially which is all around the car, especially the software and the hardware application in really in close connection perhaps to Singaporean startups. And really a lot of young startups want to get in business, and that's why I think the car industry is really faced on I think one of the biggest change they ever had. I can remember, perhaps the last sentence, I can remember on the managing director of Audi, he said, I think it's perhaps half or a year ago, he said, the next 10 years we will get more change in the car industry we had not the last 100 years before. And I think with this one sentence, you can describe all the big transformation in which we are in it.
Yeah, so question was, what are the main challenges that we face with new mobility services and offers in Germany? So first, legal framework is from 1930 that we are facing when it comes to getting new services like on-demand ride-pooling shuttles on the road. Even though we work with cities and public transport together and they run the operations, they often get denied the permit to run those services because the administration doesn't know those kind of services. So they rather deny the permit than allow something. They don't want to create a process. So that's something that we are facing on the one hand, but the government is working around it. The coalition treaty said that they're touching the PBFG, the law, so I'm optimistic that within this administration that we see some changes in here without opening the market too much and allowing Didi and Uber to run us over in the market. So it's always a scale is between letting innovation happen on the one hand and opening the market totally on the other. Since we're running those services as part of public transport, we have to make it accessible for everyone, and other players like Didi and Uber, they don't. So that is also a huge problem. Another problem we have is a federalism in Germany because we have different regulatory bodies and affairs in every different part of Germany. And we have a very diverse public transport system. We have about 600 PTOs in Germany, and they all have their own tariffs. They all have, most of them have their own software and hardware partners they've been working with for years. So we have different data structures everywhere. problem is also for planning new services. Where do I get my data and how can I use it? Who owns the data? Data ownership is a huge problem here in Germany. It's not completely regulated, so we are running blind sometimes. We don't know where to get it on a safe legal basis, so that happens a lot. And when I see we have other customers in other parts of Europe. So if I look at our customer in Portugal, they started with a small project in Lisbon, then they scaled to Porto, and now they have a nationwide platform that works. And the German VDV platform for public transport all over Germany, so to pay tickets with one app for all over Germany, they've been working on that for 7 years now, and it's not finished yet. So in Portugal, we had half a year and it's running. So the problem is you have too many players in Germany with too many own interests to have a scalable option.
And now the drones.
So that's another area that's quite close to my heart personally. In my last job, I was director of the Futures and Transformation Division at the Ministry of Transport. So drones was one area that we put in quite a lot of effort to encourage in Singapore. And really, if you think about it, drones can really help us to increase productivity significantly. So today, if you think about it already, a lot of the dull, dirty, dangerous kind of tasks we can already do with drones. So things like building inspections. Traditionally in the past, you may need someone on the scaffolding or, inspecting the building using its eyes manually. Today, you can fly a drone and you can do the same job in far less time, with far less man hours needed. But that is just even today with what we call visual line of sight flight of drones. Again, you need a human to fly it. So the next bound, I think, for all of us is really when we can do autonomous, beyond visual line of sight drone flight. And this is, I think, really where we are all hoping to go when you're talking about using drones for parcel deliveries, for instance, but even when you're talking about air taxis as well. So I think, Volocopter is one example, or in fact Lilium and so on. I think today, for most of them, they are going to start with piloted flights to begin with, because in almost every country, unless you're really talking about extremely rural areas, the airspace is still fairly congested and complicated, whether they have buildings or not, but it enables, I think, them using humans to initially fly the drones to offer air taxi services. But I think even for them, they're hoping to move beyond quickly to autonomous flights, because this is really where I think it makes more sense from the commercial point of view, when you can remove the pilot, and a lot of these flights can then take off. But I think for that to happen, there's still quite a bit that needs to be done in terms of having what we call UAS traffic management system. I know here in Germany there are many players like DFS as well who's working quite hard on this. But it's something that I think all authorities or governments need to put in place before we can really see the whole ecosystem flourish, and the day when you can see many drones in the air and coordinating with one another autonomously, making sure that they don't hit one another or hit buildings. So that's, I think, the vision that everybody is hoping to achieve, but it may take a bit of time before we can get there.
So talking about all those different innovations, I guess, how can Singapore and Germany benefit from each other, also in terms of the disruptive innovations Mr. Hefele just said on the beginning of this event? Or is that something not disruptive, what we need, or is that automotive, what we actually good at in Germany, or what you're good at in Singapore? What do we need and how can we benefit?
Maybe I'll just kick off. I think Ambassador already mentioned some of the things that we're doing to collaborate. So I think, at least even for LTA, we work very closely with many German companies actually, and we bounce ideas off each other. There are many German companies also doing trials in Singapore. So Continental and Bosch are both, they have a huge presence in Singapore actually, and they're both doing autonomous driving trials in Singapore. But I think even at the authority or regulator level, there are many exchanges really between both sides. So for us, we actually have an MOU with the German Federal Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure, where we undertake to meet each other on a regular basis, exchange information. So I think that there is that close government to government, as well as industry to government and industry to industry conversation already ongoing. And I think ideally we can even, encourage that to flourish even further and have further, more exchanges even. Yeah.
So even if we don't have a contract with Singapore yet, so we've been in contact with Singapore before. So my CEO went to Singapore last November in a meeting with your authority at the German embassy. We've been in close contact with your PTO, and we've been talking about different on-demand solutions. So there is an exchange of what are your needs, what is the technology we have. So there has always been an open line of communication between Singapore and Germany. And I've been working for the Foreign Office for quite some time before I switched to door-to-door. So I've seen that has been a huge exchange on the government level, and as well on the industry level. We had so many roundtables. We had matching roundtables between Singapore industry and German startups and the other way around. So there is a lot of exchange, and there's a lot of potential we can work together. And I think it's not only mobility, I think in every other field. And you mentioned IoT before with all the sensors, and I think we have some great IoT companies here in Germany that would benefit from your regulatory framework, which makes it very easier to use those technologies properly and to generate more value through data. Like SAP is very interested in working with you guys. I see Software AG from Darmstadt and other players. So there is a lot of going on at the moment, and I think there is always potential for more.
I think what you have said is true, but from my perspective, Germany still has a lot to offer, notwithstanding all the issues that many of you have pointed out and which I personally sympathize, because I am Singaporean and I'm the ambassador, but I have also lived here in Germany for 3 years. I also use public transport. My wife takes the S-Bahn and the U-Bahn to do her marketing. My son takes the bus to go to school. So mobility affects all of us, regardless of whether you're German or Singaporean. But the future of mobility, I think Germany, don't be too pessimistic. There's still a lot that Germany has to offer. You are absolutely right that in Singapore, we seem to have figured it out. We seem to be on the move. But I can tell you, one of the challenges that we have is, and this is just one of many challenges that we have. And that is, it's not so much a mindset that people are not prepared to try new modes of transport or they are not open. But we don't have that level of expertise that you have here in Germany. And that's why we depend quite a fair bit on foreign talent. And that's why we say we need to look for foreign partners to work with. You have developed actually very deep knowledge. I mean, a good example is your parliamentarian sitting on my left, your startup sitting on my right. They have very deep knowledge about how mobility ought to be organized, of course, to fit the rural as well as the urban context. In Singapore, it's very different, right? It's mostly urban. We don't have an automobile industry in Singapore. We don't have to think about at least 500,000 employees what happens when you have mobility and these people, their jobs are threatened. You know, as Chris said just now, we have even problems attracting people to work, to drive vehicles, and so we are driven by necessity. I think really one thing that Germany can teach Singapore is, you know, your education system and how you actually move and mobilize your workforce and your student population to go in a direction that is very innovative, since the theme of the Asia Pacific Weeks is about innovation. Ultimately, mobility can only go so far. Fundamentally, it's about innovation. It's about the people that drive mobility. And if you don't have the people, no amount of cars and vehicles and buses and drones and air taxis is going to get you anywhere.
Do you want to say?
Yeah, I think it was good that you point on a little bit, which is perhaps not so perfect in Germany, especially in case of marketing. I'm definitely with you that we can improve that, for sure. On the other hand, I think especially the national platform of future mobility takes into account, and you not only takes the politicians, then you take the society. I wrote it down. There are a lot of people of business from the civil society and all these who are from the technology side, which are all get their ideas into this national platform, and then we can gain or get these really important ideas for our future mobility. And that's why I think it's the most important things, all these good ideas to bring together. And that's quite hard, since perhaps in difference to Singapore, a lot of Germans are quite afraid of this big change which are we in front of, and that's why they are not saying, wow, I'm so excited when we have a lot of e-mobility and a lot of air taxis. For them, they are in the back, oh my God, perhaps I lose my working place, oh my God, perhaps I'm not able to have my own car, which I can regulate or can, how is it called? To move it in my own from A to B. That's why I think we have to be a little bit, to take all these afraids a little bit into account, and that's why perhaps it seems not to go so fast than it could be, or it's in the other countries. But on the other side, I think perhaps a little bit the question which we had before, I think especially our collaboration is already very, very good between Singapore and Germany in a lot of cases. And I think we can intensify it in the future, especially our committee on transport and digital infrastructure is planning a trip to Singapore and Japan in this year. It's perfect now for this panel today. I just heard from this idea 2 weeks ago, and I will be member on this committee which goes to Singapore. That's fine, and that's why I'm really looking forward for this for this nice trip, I think, and to intensify especially these really close connection between Singapore and Germany, especially in the technological ideas and the mobility for the future.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're at the end of this event today. I think this discussion is going to be followed up in Singapore. Well, thank you very much for being here today. And I'm really excited about how the German and Singaporean cooperation will shape the future of mobility. And I'm really thankful that you were here. And I also want to thank the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation and the Embassy of Singapore for making this event possible. And I wish you all an exciting day, and I hope we see each other again. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.